Hey everyone, my name is Taryn Finley, culture reporter and Black Voices editor at HuffPost, and also your host for tonight's Build event, Reporting While Black, a conversation about the 2020 election and Black journalists' role in it. We have a great conversation in store for you tonight with leaders in journalism from HuffPost, Yahoo. But first, let's introduce our panelists. First, we have HuffPost editor-in-chief and my boss, Lydia Polgreen. Yahoo News producer and reporter Marquise Francis. We also have with us on-air reporter and senior writer Kristin Myers. And last but not least, HuffPost front page editor Phil Lewis. Welcome, y'all. Now, audience in studio and at home, we're gonna need your help. We definitely want to engage you all in this conversation, so make sure that you use the hashtag #ReportingWhileBlack on Twitter, and our engagement host, Elizabeth Idokwe, may read your comments and questions for our panelists to answer. All right, y'all, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us. And this year, 2020 is, of course, a big election year, but let's get this straight before we start this conversation. This isn't about the candidates. This is about your experiences as Black journalists and the contributions that we make that are so crucial in our newsrooms. And before we dive in, I think it's really important to give our audience some context. Starting with you, Lydia, could you talk to us about your role in leading HuffPost's newsroom in this year as we go deep into 2020?
Absolutely. I run HuffPost, which is obviously one of the biggest and most important digital news platforms in the world. And I feel incredibly privileged as a Black woman to have that privilege of overseeing such a big part of our culture and to be able to represent and tell stories of our communities in really powerful ways. And so I really think that it's my job to make sure that we're truly representing, not just telling the stories of people of color and particularly Black communities, but really give voice and let Black people be the authors of their own stories at HuffPost. And, it's thanks to folks like you, Taryn, editor of Black Voices, that really bring that to life. But that's really at the heart of who we are at HuffPost, is giving representation and giving voice.
Yeah, thank you for that. Phil, what about you?
Yeah, hit the nail on the head, right? So I'm front page editor there, and it's a pretty unique role. So I pretty much kind of just sit atop this perch on the front page where we curate stories, stories that you see on the front end. I'm kind of behind the scenes. I'm not really in the field or anything like that mostly, but we come up with the ways to package the stories. So going on the front page, the headlines, the splash heads, alert text that we send in your phone, all those sorts of things. We work on that and we combine it so you can see pretty much what the HuffPost, what the brand is.
Phil's being a little bit modest. I mean, the HuffPost homepage is iconic, right? You go to the HuffPost homepage and you've got the big splash in front of you, and it tells you what's the most important news of the day, and most importantly, how should you feel about it? And I think the genius of what Phil and the team that Phil works on, what they do, is that they really get to the heart of the matter. The headlines are in your face. They're funny sometimes they're poignant. But I feel like the great thing about having an awesome journalist like Phil, coming from the perspective that he comes from, running the homepage of HuffPost, is really a great opportunity to give voice to and representation to our communities. And so you're bringing that perspective to one of the most important billboards on the internet, which is really exciting.
I appreciate that. It sounds like I also need a raise. So that is so great. That is so great. Yeah. You all heard it.
Yeah. Phil's also very humble. No. Kristin, what about you?
So I work at Yahoo Finance as one of the writers there. I pretty much cover, at Yahoo Finance, we talk a lot about the markets, but of course we also talk about businesses, but just about everyday issues that impact pretty much everyone's wallets, what's happening in your pockets. And that's essentially where I come in. So I do a lot on politics, on domestic policy. I talk a lot about issues that face Black Americans, women, millennials. So I try to draw the line from the latest law to how your bank account's going to be impacted.
Yeah, definitely. Marquise?
Yeah, so at Yahoo News, when I first joined the team almost 3 years ago, I just saw, what they were currently doing, which was a lot of great work, but there were a lot of seasoned journalists doing a lot of the things growing up I could not relate to. So what I saw as an opportunity was to figure out a way to kind of connect where politics and culture come together. So in doing so, if I can make or produce something or talk to someone where I feel as though politics is now more relatable, that's what I seek to do. So 2019 was really a great year, sitting down with folks like Charlemagne, The God, and Killer Mike, and Stacey Abrams. So I'm looking to just continue that in 2020 and moving forward. If I can talk to the likes of Cardi B, John Legend, I feel as though a young Marquise can relate more to that. So that's my goal.
Yeah, you're killing it. I mean, all of you are clearly killing it. And let's be real. There's a huge pressure on Black journalists that our white colleagues don't have to face. There's definitely a smaller margin for error for us. Lydia, as an industry vet and, as a newsroom exec, I'm wondering how you've seen expectations placed on Black journalists change as the industry shifts.
Yeah, it's been really interesting because when I started my career, and I think I'm a lot older than everybody else on this stage. When I started my career, it was essentially assumed that if you were a Black journalist, you didn't want to be pigeonholed as like covering Black things. That was like, oh no. You want to make sure that you're doing what are quote unquote mainstream beats, right? So if you were on the quote race beat, somehow you were limiting your career options. So when I first started in journalism, people were like, oh no, you don't want to be typecast as a journalist who only covers Black things. Make sure that you cover, business or, if you're going to become a foreign correspondent, which was what I did for much of my career when I was at the New York Times, my last job, they were like, well, don't go to Africa because it's, that's a job for Black people. You should go to Asia, or you should go to the Middle East. And I think the positive thing is I think there's been a real step change in that. And I think that through the extraordinary work of journalists, some of whom are on the stage with me right now, but also, former colleagues of mine like Nicole Hannah-Jones, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and others who've really shown that writing about race is really about writing the story of America. And that it's actually... There's nothing marginal about the stories of people of color in this country. They are the history of America, and so I think on the positive side, that's been a great thing to see happen. I think something that's a little bit more challenging is that you are seeing, as those stories are valued, you're seeing some tokenism. People bring in people of color into their newsroom and then don't empower them, don't give them the training and support that they need to grow and to become the great contributors that they could be. They're not getting the kind of training or opportunities. People get pigeonholed as just writing takes, for example, as opposed to being given opportunities to go out and do investigative reporting or cultural reporting or whatever it is. And then finally, I think there's a double standard around particularly how journalists comport themselves and express their opinions on social media. And I think this has been a real hot button topic lately, where there's been a lot of focus on journalists of color who express what are seen as opinions about issues that touch on race. But really, I think we've come to see that those aren't opinions, that's knowledge. And when you hire journalists of color, you're hiring them in part because they're bringing knowledge that you don't have. And you can't then turn around and say, oh, no, that's opinion. You can't make a claim about, for example, the role of race in the inspiration of the Tea Party movement, for example, that's expressing an opinion, and we don't do that. It's not an opinion. It's part of your expertise, and so I think it's a complex picture. I think there are lots of great opportunities, and I think that the stories that we tell have been elevated in really important ways. But I think there's still a long way to go.
Yeah. I love that you said that. Because I was just in college 6 years ago, and I had professors, at my HBCU telling me to not cover Black issues, even though this was something that I was really passionate about. And, you know, I just love to see that you all have really done your due justice in covering these issues. And Marquise, I want to go to you because you do a lot of reporting in the field. You've been at various different political events and Trump rallies. I want to go to a clip of Marquise talking to a voter this past year.
We shouldn't have walls. Look at Nancy Pelosi. She's got a wall. Look at Chuck.
Where's her wall at?
Where's the wall? Nancy Pelosi's house. Look at Nancy Pelosi. She's got a wall at her house. Look at Chuck.
So I have one more question. The president in 2016 said he was going to build the wall. Where's the wall?
It's there. It's slowly progressing, but it's there.
That was an interesting exchange, Marquise.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what challenges, if any, I'm pretty sure there are many, but what challenges do you face in the field as a Black man?
Yeah, just to the point earlier, I know a lot of people, you said at your HBCU, you were told, shy away from Black issue. I try to be as Black as possible. I walk in the room Black, and I just try to be as Black as possible. So I'm going to these, I think that was the launch of President Trump's re-election campaign in Orlando, Florida. So I think that was about my 4th rally at that point. I'd been to 2 in Minnesota and 2, so maybe my 5th, 2 in Texas. So I think at that point, I've kind of know how it is. My first rally, I would definitely say I was a bit anxious, if that's the right word, just because you see what you see on media how a lot of folks respond to Black anything at these different rallies. So just knowing what my purpose is, I'm there to ask people questions. I'm not there to argue with them, but I'm also there to dispute the facts. Like this gentleman was talking about how President Trump is building a wall. We know that there is no wall being built. He's replacing some wall that's already was there and different things like that. So it's just calling truth to power and just understanding I'm there to do a job. I want to come home safely. So, calling people out, but presenting, what I'm seeing, sights and sounds, and just going from there.
Yeah, definitely. Kristin, you are on air and writing daily, and you also have the double whammy of being Black and a woman. And I think that's exemplified in this clip that we're about to watch.
Actually, that's what the bill is to find out. It's not necessarily to say we're going to give reparations, but it's to say who exactly should be receiving.
So who would it be? Who would get? How many people?
So right now they say approximately 30 million people, but still they have to come up with a proposal of who deserves reparations.
$17 trillion. I
don't know if it would
I would argue that as a white man in America, you've received the benefits that have.
That's what we're talking about here too.
But I know a lot of white men in America that if you just looked at their financial situation and didn't see their color or where they came from, you'd be like, that guy hadn't benefited. Right here in New York, within 1 block of here.
Also, an interesting exchange.
Yeah.
And
That was a battle.
Yeah, and it was clear in that clip that it was a battle, and I'm wondering, especially being a Black woman and interacting with a predominantly white male industry, like, do you feel heard? Do you think what are the challenges that you're facing?
So for me, I think it's a little bit interesting, and this is kind of where colorism can come into play, because obviously I'm much lighter than my counterparts here up on this stage, which gives me it gives me a privilege in that, I have to admit that, but with that privilege, I think also comes like a need to sometimes speak to people that might listen to me, that might not listen to people, my brothers and sisters that are much darker than me. So I don't think it's so much the question of, am I seen and always heard? I think it's, am I understood? I think that people will sometimes see me. I think they'll hear what I'm saying to them, but I don't think they always quite get it. I don't think they always understand what I'm telling them, which comes from me from a point of experience. Like, this is my lived experience. This is the experience of my mother, of my aunts and uncles, of my brother, of my cousins. I'm telling you that this is the experience for them. This is an issue that is important to them. We need to be talking about this, right? Lydia and Marquise were talking earlier about covering stories like as a Black journalist, and if you should shy away from that. This is the thing. Race isn't necessarily the issue. It is something that cross-cuts all issues. It is a lens through which we approach everything. And if we're thinking this, right, if we are thinking as the journalist, hey, like, this actually impacts me as a Black person, actually this impacts me as a woman, this impacts me as a Black woman, chances are there's someone out there that's also thinking about how it impacts them, and it's our job to ask those questions that they don't get to ask from those politicians or those government officials. It's our job to really talk about the story that other people might miss because we're able to approach it from that different mindset.
Yeah, definitely. Lydia, I'm wondering the same question for you, especially as a Black queer woman who sits at the top of a masthead of a national outlet. What are the challenges that you're facing?
Well, I mean, I think I'm in a relatively privileged position because I'm the boss, right? And so I've been in, thanks to the stewardship of the folks that own HuffPost at Verizon, they've been great supporters. They tell me, keep doing what you're doing. We believe in your vision for HuffPost, and we want to see you succeed. So I feel like I'm in a very lucky position. At the same time, you're always going out into the world and having these conversations, and I feel like I have, because of that privilege, an enormous responsibility to ask the questions and to deploy our journalistic resources to interrogate these issues in a way that is really meaningful. You and Phil were just in South Carolina doing some reporting on Black voters, and one of the things that drives me absolutely crazy is this notion of heartland. People talk about heartland voters. Well, I'm from the Midwest, right? I'm from Minnesota. That is the heartland. There are lots of Black people there. And when people say heartland on national TV, what they're talking about is like a white person in a diner. They're not thinking about people of color who live all across this country. When they talk about rural Americans, right? They're the picture that they're immediately is in their mind is of a white person. There are lots of people of color who work in and live in rural areas in this country. I mean, our reporting, the reporting you guys did took you to Columbia, but you go into rural South Carolina, you're going to tell me that there aren't Black folks living in the country? Of course there are. So really complicating the idea and the picture that people have when we use these coded phrases. That I feel is like a really important part of my job as an editor, is to call that out and say, like, we don't talk that way at HuffPost. Like, we don't say, when we say working class, we don't assume that we're talking about white people, right? Because, like, the reality is the majority of working class people in this country are people of color. Yeah. When we talk about rural people, when we talk about people in the heartland, I mean, what is the heartland anyway? We talk about people in the Midwest. We're talking about all kinds of people. So to me, I like to use my position of power and privilege, and I'm like really happy with my power. Like, I like to use it to really aggressively tell these stories in a way that that complicates the simple pundit-driven ideas that have been implanted in our heads for so long.
Yeah, definitely. I'm also from the Midwest, and so are you, Phil.
Detroit.
Three Black people up here from the Midwest people. But yeah, Phil, to that point, I'm wondering, especially running Point on the front page and seeing so many headlines that come through every day. You're just like very plugged in. Can you talk about the role that races play in this specific election cycle and how you, as your job, to kind of deviate from some of the like cliche and quite frankly stereotypical ways that we've seen marginalized voters, even candidates? Like how have you challenged the status quo on the front page at HuffPost?
Ooh, it's a lot. No. So I guess really just kind of the thing about the front page is that everyone sees it, right? So everyone sees it, and so it's up to us to kind of make sure that, for example, people aren't being cut out or being erased. Like, for example, the African climate activist Vanessa Nakate, when she was, the Associated Press cut her picture out of the climate activists with Greta Thunberg and those. Like, we have to make sure that those things aren't happening. That's sort of like what my role is, kind of like to make sure that there's no erasure happening with certain stories. Even when we went to South Carolina, we're trying to make sure that people's stories are being told, you know, and so I find my role really important as far as making sure that all stories are told, you know, and I really enjoy that kind of about my job in particular. And just race, but race in general has played it's really played like an integral role in our coverage, right? Like we've seen reparations being talked about on the debate stage. We've seen voter suppression talked about on the debate stage. I mean, Tom Steyer was getting ready to go in his pocket and be like, here's, you know, money on the debate stage, right? So race it's really, it's not, it's like you said, it's not just one thing, it's the thing, right? And so it's up to us to kind of make sure that we're covering that fairly and accurately.
Yeah.
Well, and I think if I could just jump on top of, on that, I think one of the things that that I'm particularly proud of that the front page team does at HuffPost is like we're not about mincing our words. You know, we're not about whitewashing. We're not about saying that something is racially charged or using other euphemisms to not offend. I think you know, Phil has been a big part of driving us to think really carefully about the words that we use and not try to sanitize just because it's going to hurt people's feelings. And you know, I feel really lucky to be working with colleagues who push me too. I mean, when we had a conversation about whether the word black should be capitalized, I was like, oh, hold on. You know, my team that included Taryn and Phil were like, we should do this, and I was like, you are right, and we did it. So
Can I just say that I love that? Like, at HuffPost, I can say something's racist. I don't have to say racially tinged, racially baked into the cake, racially. You know, I can just say what it is. You know, so I really do
Call a
appreciate
spade
that.
a spade.
You can do that.
I will say, but I think that's really speaking to what this panel's about, right? So whereas HuffPost, where Lydia is leading as a black woman, these aren't questions that really need to be asked, or if they're asked, they can be answered very quickly. I think it's a challenge, you know, when you're dealing with publications, who don't have leaders, you know, black leaders. So a lot of these things are a bit more nuanced, so they take a little bit more challenge. I agree with black, of course it should be capitalized, like that's who we are. But I think it's just about navigating that. And I think I speak for myself when I say, you know, in covering a lot of the stories that I think are important, it's a little bit harder. You know, I instead of saying, oh, I should go talk to Killer Mike in Atlanta, I may have to explain who Killer Mike is. You know, I may have to explain why he's important and how he's able to connect with different types of people. And it's something that a lot of other people may not have to do. So I think when we talk about reporting while black, it's, you know, certain things that are very much, you know, nature and very much regular to us, we're having to explain that to others and help them to understand. So it's oftentimes very exhausting, but it's just kind of like what it is.
Yeah.
So it's unfortunate, but it's a fight that if you're willing to kind of put yourself in, it's something you do every day.
Yeah, it's that extra bit of labor. It's that extra bit of labor. Once again, folks watching, don't forget that our engagement host, Elizabeth Idokwe, will be reading your comments and questions. Just use the hashtag reporting while black. And we'll be opening up questions again at the end. But before we move on, Lizzie, do we have questions and comments from viewers?
Actually do. We have a couple of awesome ones. So this tweet came in that reminds me a lot of what Phil was just speaking about the importance of kind of including people in the photos on the front page. It's from Christine, who is an In the Know producer from our New York office. She says, when you are hashtag reporting while black, I think it's important to pay attention to how other POCs are shown in the media. For example, when picking thumbnails for videos and photos, I feel responsible to pick images that will help people approach the story without bias. I try to shy away from images that make people of color look angry or dangerous, or facial expressions that might turn people away from the true meaning of the story and reinforce harmful stereotypes. Which I thought was really nice. And then we have a question actually from Greg, who's an engineering director from our Illinois office. He asks, to you guys, political coverage often marginalizes groups of voters. For example, in 2020, I often hear comments such as, black voters support Biden because he was Obama's VP. As black reporters, do you think you are more aware of this marginalization? And if so, what do you do actively to combat it?
So this is that's language that's been used for a very long time. We like to think, we do not think of white voters as a monolith, but we definitely think that way about black voters, about Hispanic voters, about Asian voters. We like to think about any race that's other than white. We like to think as a giant monolith, and that's part of the problem. Because we've seen, while we know black women overwhelmingly, for example, did not vote for Trump, we see that along with black men that they voted along very different issues. We definitely see that black voters, they care about different things. So especially for me, it's my job to really talk about the issues that are important to just people in general and the groups that are supporting it. You know, maybe we can group people by, you know, the Midwest or the Northeast or the college educated, or particularly Yahoo Finance, we start to consider, you know, social class or economic class. You know, lower income voters actually vote this way. This includes black voters, Hispanic voters, white voters, you know, Christians, Muslims, like of all different swaths of the country. And then you get to really start to get a true sense of where people are on the political spectrum.
And I'll just add to that, to answer Greg's question, you know, how do you combat that? I think from my perspective, is talking to people. It frustrates me to no end when I'm in, you know, out or even in the office and folks are saying, oh, Trump voters think this. And in my head, I'm like, have you ever been to a Trump rally? Like, have you talked to your one cousin who believes this? So I'm at these Trump rallies, and to be honest, I never had any crazy experiences. These people are saying things that I may disagree with or that I just don't think makes any sense, but they're regular people. They're wearing these Make America Great Again hats, but then they take them off and they could be your school librarian. You know, so these people are people. And then I remember at one rally, I'm trying to think where it was. I think it might have been in El Paso. There was a black man who was an immigrant from Africa, and he was like, oh, I love Trump. And I'm like, but how? He just said your country is the SHIT whole country. He's like, oh, I don't believe that. I don't care, you know? And that's the type of perspective that most people may not see. They just assume, oh, all Africans probably are not for Trump, but it's not true. They believe many different things. So I think one way is actually talking to people, asking them questions. But I constantly hear from folks like, wow, I didn't even know that was a perspective. I watched your video and I gained that. So just talking to people.
Right. I mean, I think like when Trump is like, well, that judge is against, you know, that judge can't be trusted because he's Mexican and I'm building a wall. It's the exact same thing, right? That to assume that all black people have the same perspective, to assume that, for example, police violence is the issue that black people care about. It's like, actually, black people really care a lot about crime because we're disproportionately victims of crime. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean that we want like unfettered stop and frisk. We absolutely don't. But, you know, you get it coming and going on both sides of the coin. Yep. So I think like seeing black communities as whole communities with extraordinary diversity within them is absolutely essential in that representation, right? Like, I mean, I feel like so much of the national coverage is like, you know, black voters want this, or Latino voters like only care about immigration. And it's just not true. You can ask any reporter or frankly, any member of that community, and they'll give you a different answer of like, what's the issue that they care about most. And I think the most important thing that we can do to fight racism is to not treat people as if they're a monolith and that their race determines like how they're going to feel about any given issue. Like treat people like whole 360-degree humans.
Amen. Amen. Phil, that's a big reason why we even went down to South Carolina,
That's exactly
right?
what I was going to say. I was pretty much going to say, like, Taryn and I, we went to South Carolina to do a project where we talked with black voters about just what do they care about. You know, it's a small sample size. We're in Columbia. We talked to as many people as we could talk to, but we just saw a huge range of like different issues that they cared about, from student loan debt to climate change to the one Republican that we talked to about, and he was, just read the story when it comes out. Just read it, you know, check it out. But I mean, that was the whole point of going to South Carolina, to really kind of show people that they're like we're not a monolith, like you were saying, and I think that a lot of the onus is on media companies too, like newsrooms. You know, I've seen 3,000 stories about why the random Trump voter in Milwaukee, you know, is not going to vote. But there's very few stories about black voters. Like I haven't seen that many stories out there about black voters and the things that we care about. You know, so.
Well, I mean, and also like, you know, there was a big story about black voters in the 2016 election, and that is that they did not turn out for Hillary, and like, why? You know, and that to me is as important a political story as any of the stories about why white people love Trump. You know, like it's you're just not doing your job if you're not asking like who's here and who's not here.
Right.
Well, I think we like to make the assumption that black folks only care about an issue only so far as their skin color, right? Black issues are issues that everyone has, right? Black folks are wondering how they're going to put their kid through college, how they're going to pay their student loan bills. They're wondering about their credit scores, about health care. You know, should we have Medicare for all? Should we not? Should we do a public option? That's going to change based on where they are in the country or what their economic, scenario looks like. They also care about taxes. It's not just, I am black, therefore I am going to be voting, well, for anyone but Trump. The story does not stop there. And I think we do a huge disservice to our readers and to our viewers and just to Americans in general to assume as if black folks only care about things because it's black or it's not, right? Black people care about a lot of other issues other than just this is our skin color.
Yeah, I mean, one of my pet peeves about the coverage of the primary was people asking, like, why aren't black people supporting black candidate X? And I was like, that's not how it works. You know, like nobody's. It just seems crazy that you would expect that just because someone is the same color as you, that you would automatically support them politically. These are smart voters who are looking carefully at the issues, assessing who they think can win. They're making their own judgments about electability, whatever that means. But they're voters like anybody else.
Yeah, we're pragmatic as voters. Kristin, to your point, I think that it's really important that we don't see black people or black issues as niche. And I think a lot of times, especially our conversations, we've talked about people sending you hate mail when you cover certain issues about the fact that there is, mass incarceration, the fact that reparations are a real thing and we need to be having these conversations. And those stories perform well. People want to read about these things, So I'm wondering, why do you think, or do you feel as though people are more critical of black journalists, especially when they're covering these issues?
So I think when someone sees a black journalist, they think two things. One, that they only care about black stories or black issues, which is not true. Like, yes, I do care about black stories. I do care about black issues. I also care about immigrant issues because I'm from a family of immigrants. And I also care about women issues because I'm a woman. I care about millennial issues because I'm a millennial. I care about a whole lot of things that have nothing to do with my race. And so when I think that some people look at a black journalist, right? And so they say, okay, well, one, they can only care about something insofar as that they're black. And two, I don't trust what they have to say because they have some kind of hidden agenda. And I think now that we have the rise of this rhetoric around fake news and fake media, the media's lying to us, they particularly think that a journalist that is of a particular race or ethnicity must have some sort of hidden agenda to uplift themselves or their community. I do have an agenda, newsflash. It's to tell the truth. It's to follow a story wherever it takes me. It's to report the data as accurately and as fairly as possible. That's my agenda. It's never to lie to anyone because then I wouldn't be doing my job. As for the hate mail, I get quite a bit. Sometimes people like to attack me on Twitter. But I just think that goes to show that what we've all been saying before, black stories are everyone's story, Black issues impact everyone in this country, whether you like to think it or not. Part of my job is to really draw the line between whatever's happening somewhere, for example, locking children up in cages on the border. This is why you should care. This is why it's important to you. This is how, at least for me in that story, this is how it's impacting your bottom line as a taxpayer. I did a story on incarcerating innocent black men in particular, and it's costly. It is very expensive. Racism is very expensive. I mean, it is. It's expensive and it's inefficient. If you want your taxpayer dollars to go further, perhaps you shouldn't be voting for, racist policies, for example. Like you need to think about that. And it doesn't matter what race you are. It doesn't matter what age you are. These are things that you need to consider.
Yeah, definitely. Last year, NABJ, National Association of Black Journalists, sent out, they really slammed CBS because their lineup of journalists who were covering the election were all white at the top of last year. Marquise, we have these conversations all the time. How does the lack of diversity, the lack of our voices being included in these conversations hurt journalism?
Yeah, it doesn't give you the full scope of what the story is, right? Like I mentioned, the reason why I feel as though I tackle the different stories or topics that I find interesting is because I saw that there was a gap there. Like I mentioned, a lot of the folks on my team are more seasoned and they're focused on investigative things and things within the White House, which are great. But there's also a lot of things happening outside of the White House that are just as important for a large amount of people. So if we're not having, journalists who, run the spectrum of young, older, more seasoned, into investigations, into culture, into different things, music, you're not getting the full spectrum. I mean, we're seeing in sports how activism is alive and well, and that plays a role in politics and what Kaepernick is doing and whatnot. We see in music folks who are letting their voice be known. So if you don't know who these folks are, then you're leaving out a large amount of the perspective. So I just think the more journalists of color we have and the more people that are telling our stories, because I also think there is power to, if I'm sitting here and talking to, I don't know, Stacey Abrams, I think it's going to be a different interview versus possibly a white journalist talking to him. Not to say they can't do a great job at the interview, but she may be more comfortable saying something to me or talking a certain way. And there's power in that. We're able to connect on certain things. When I went down in Atlanta to speak to her, just seeing her, how she interacted with her sister was just so jovial. And I was like, wow, she's actually a real person. It seems so simple, but, she was just hanging around and doing different poses and taking photos. And I'm just like, I'm seeing who she is as a person. And I'm not so sure someone who you don't feel as comfortable with, you'll let that guard down as much. So it's definitely important.
Yeah, trust is important, especially, we're in an age where misinformation is spread. This whole looming idea of fake news is still kind of hanging over the industry. And Lydia, this one is for you, especially in the fast-paced nature of social media and how, a lot of folks are getting information about candidates, about just like news in general. I'm wondering how you ensure that our news is not only accessible, but also trusted by marginalized communities.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and I think that so much of the focus on fake news has been on the sort of like the Trump end of things. But I think that marginalized communities of color, the queer community has a lot to ask of institutions of the mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream media, right? And I would definitely include HuffPost. I mean, look, I'm an African American woman who's leading a news organization, but we like our staff is not as diverse as we'd like it to be, and people hold us accountable for that, and I think that's great. All the people who at me on Twitter to point that out, thank you. We need that. We need that accountability. I send them to my boss. I send them to our head of D&I, who's here with us tonight, and I say, hey, let's open up some new jobs at HuffPost. But I think that communities of color are absolutely right to demand more and to hold the media accountable for the ways in which they cover their communities. And I am perhaps unusual in the sense that I really invite that scrutiny. It feels uncomfortable sometimes, but the only way we're going to make forward progress and the only way we're going to have trust with the communities who, at the end of the day, it's our job to serve, is by seeing ourselves as servants, as people whose role it is to meet people's needs for news and information. And so I try to come to it with a lot of humility and a lot of listening, and just think really carefully about how can I serve that audience every day.
Yeah.
I have a question. I have just something that just popped into my head, and I'm sure folks have also heard this on this panel, you including Taryn. I'm just curious, have you guys ever heard, maybe there's a story you want to cover and you're not able to, or a topic that you want to really delve into, and for whatever reason you're not able to do that, your day job, and folks are like, oh, why don't you just do it on your own, or why don't you make your own publication? But obviously there's so many hurdles to that, right? And I think reporting while Black, you have to figure out how to fit what you want to do through the lens of someone else. I'm just curious, of folks' perspectives on that, and what do you respond to that? Because I think that's a big part of it, right? There's so many things we want to cover that we know is important, but like I mentioned earlier, if I can't explain it the right way to certain folks, it's not going to be covered.
Do you mean creating your own community outlet,
I mean, it could be anything. Yeah, maybe, creating your own thing, your own series, or having this story that is important, interviewing this great guest you can get, but the powers that be are saying, it's not going to happen.
When someone asks me about that, I just tell them, where's the money? I'll
Right.
if you got the money, then we can do it. Because I feel like that's the biggest hurdle, right? At least in my eyes, it takes money to do these things. It takes money to hire, right? It takes money to do all these sorts of things. And so that's usually my response is, the money, where's the time, because there's a lot of time that goes into this too. And I'm burnt.
I was just about to say, I don't,
Yeah.
you know what? I'm tired. I've just worked a long day. I don't want to have to now create my own platform as well, to tell a story, and I don't think that I should have to, I work at a platform to tell stories. Now I have to go out and create my own. Now, if I want to go and branch out on my own, leave my current job and start something new, that's something else. I think that with the rise of social media, YouTube, Twitter, et cetera, people think that it's just like that, and you can just go and create your own news platform and have it be widely seen, shared, and spread. Well, that's not actually true. Just because a story is great doesn't mean that it goes viral. Now, if you really feel so pressed and you feel so, if you're really, passionate about something and you want to go pursue that, I think that's great. But it's are we asking white journalists to go do that if they can't tell every story that they want to tell? On some level, when you're in a newsroom, you do have to accept that, not every story you want to tell, you'll get to tell. Everyone's been in an editorial meeting and you pitch something, you're like, oh, this is great. Everyone's going to love this. There's no way they can say no. And then they say no. And that happens often. We've all been there. It's not the first time it's happened to me. It's not going to be the last. I don't know if the response is every single time that I'm like, you know what? I'm going to just go make my own newspaper.
Yeah, I think the niche is such a loaded word, right? And I think that whenever you use the word niche to present, to represent a significant percentage of the population of the country, you are using that word incorrectly, right? That is not a niche. That is a whole lot of people. Now, Black people who love Japanese anime, that might be a niche, right? People who love anime in general are a niche, right? But I think that you really have to interrogate that idea of what's a niche and be bold about asking that question, when you're in these editorial meetings. And I know that puts a lot on the individual, and ultimately, when you question your bosses, sometimes it can get uncomfortable. But I think that it's really important to speak up and lift your voice and say, you know what, hey, that's not actually a niche piece. These are issues that affect all kinds of people and stories that should be told.
Yeah, agreed. And if it's a good idea, hold on to it. Just because it's a no right now does not mean that it's going to be a no forever. But with that, we're going to go ahead and turn to audience and Twitter questions. Lizzie, you want to take it away?
Yes, I believe we have some questions. Would you like to ask one? I think you had a good one.
So my question is...
What's your name?
Nicole. Hi, I'm Nicole. I'm sorry. So you kind of touched on it, but when you are reporting or interviewing and you run into a situation where maybe your credibility is questioned because you are Black or you're, dealing with someone who is not Black, how do you handle that so that you can, continue this interview and get the same questions? And do you feel like your non-Black counterparts get better answers or more serious answers for things like the election and that kind of thing?
I mean, I've never had that experience personally, but what I would say is I'm not out here to please everyone. I think everyone knows if you're trying to do that, you'll never get anywhere. All I can do is, continue to do my job, ask the right questions, and maybe, that experience will help me moving forward, and maybe I can approach situations better. Maybe I need to have a pre-interview with this person just for them to get to know me. Maybe I can send them some of my work, and they can kind of read it for themselves. I think, folks have mentioned, we're constantly being questioned, we're constantly being challenged. I think you wake up every day as a black person knowing, the world's a little bit different for us. And are you going to let that continue to be a burden, or are you going to figure out a way to push past it? So, I think, you're going to be prepared when it comes to these interviews, and you're going to put your best foot forward. And some of them you'll knock out the park, and some of them you won't. But just understand why you're there and kind of stay focused. That's what I do.
Yeah, I've never had someone that I've interviewed question my credentials. That actually usually happens more from the audience or the readers of my article. Oh, they question me all the time. They want to know what's your degree? Can you add? Do you even know math?
Tom in Wisconsin.
Yeah, they love to ask. Yeah, they love to ask me those questions all the time. On some level, I think that if you are angering someone, sometimes it means you're doing your job right. Particularly when we talk about politics, for example, people often say that there should be an underlying tension between the media and the people that we are trying to hold to account, Politicians shouldn't exactly feel like they're buddy-buddy with us, even if you agree with their policies, I've had press secretaries, say to me oh, don't screw me. And I'm like, I'm not always going to report what you want me to, even if I like your politician, even if I liked, even if I did something that wasn't, was a little bit more favorable last week, it might not be the same next week. My job isn't here to please you. It's not to be your press person or your PR person. That's what you have PR for. My job is to ask the questions that our, readers or our viewers would ask if they were able to sit down with these people, So sometimes if you get an interviewer or someone who's being interviewed that's pushing back a little bit, depending on who it is, it might mean you're doing your job right.
I think some of the challenges that journalists, black journalists face, are frankly internal within their own organizations. Being on a slightly slower track than a reporter who is has the same amount of experience as you do. They're quickly moved through this beat, then that beat, and then next thing you know, they're reporting on the White House, whereas you're still kind of proving yourself. I think that's a pretty common experience, if I'm honest, with a lot of black journalists that I know, that they feel that typically a white editor will take them under their wing, and sometimes under someone's wing you get smothered, and you never end up flying. So I think that to me, within institutions is a big issue, and it's this kind of paternalism where it's oh, you're not ready yet, or I'm protecting you from failure, and it's well, you didn't protect him from failure. What, why do you think I need so much protection?
Yeah, definitely. We have one question from Twitter at the KG Lifestyle asks, it's been said that black women are always on the right side of history when it comes to voting and politics. History doesn't lie. So what can be done to censor their voices as we approach the next major election? That's a good question.
I mean, Phil, what'd you hear from or Taryn, what'd you hear from black women when you were in South Carolina?
They had a lot to say.
Yeah. I mean, black women don't feel like they're being heard. They don't feel like they're being listened to, and they feel as if they are also being clumped together. They feel as if they have to be the ones to save the day. And of course, throughout history, just like KG said, the KG Lifestyle said, there has been a sense that black women are going to be, the safety net to catch everything, all the ills of society. And it's we're tired. Just like you all said, we are tired. Black women across the country are tired of doing that, and it's really unfortunate that a lot more people aren't listening to Black women. A lot more people aren't voting like Black women. That's the sentiment that we got in South Carolina. Phil, what did you think?
No,
in South Carolina?
I would say that's pretty much the nail on the head. Like,
Yeah.
I won't even. You got it.
Yeah, Kristin as a Black woman.
So,
Right.
so part of speaking truth to power, right, is first you understand, right, Black women, right? So this is where you go to your reporters that are, well, Black women, right? And you start to consider, okay, what are the issues? So if we're going to talk strictly about the election, what are the issues that are concerning them the most, right? Is that the criminal justice system? Is that, student loan debt? Is that healthcare, right? Frankly, for women, but Black women in particular, we already know women tend to be heads of households. They care more about pocketbook issues the most because they're the ones controlling the purse strings, right, in the house. So they want to know exactly how everything is going to impact, how their house runs, how their kids are going to go to school, how their kids are going to eat, how their kids are going to progress and advance through life. So once you then know those issues, then you start saying, okay, these are the issues, right, X, Y, and Z. I'm going to start looking at the politicians and how they approach those issues. I'm going to start doing a deep dive. I'm going to start doing an analysis, right? How does Bernie Sanders' plan, for example, on Medicare for all, sure, impact the country as a whole, but how is it going to impact Black women? How is it going to impact Black men? How is it going to impact Hispanic families? I'm going to start doing deep dives on that issue, and then you can start to really shine a light on something that a whole segment of the population has already been screaming about for a very long time. Because if we think that something has only been talked about once a journalist decides to write an article about it, you'd be sadly mistaken. Black women have been talking about a lot of issues for a very long time, just no one bothers to listen and no one bothers to hear it. So you have to go to those voices, those marginalized voices in those marginalized communities, and you need to start asking those questions. Well, what do you care about? Why? And then you start to examine them.
I think just based on my own experience, I think Black women care a lot about dignity. And I think all humans care about dignity, but I think that particularly given the role that Black women have played in our history, the complete lack of dignity of the current situation that's going on in Washington, I think is morally offensive to a lot of Black women. It's offensive to a lot of Americans, but I think particularly to Black women, given what they've contributed to this country and to our democracy. And so I think pocketbook issues are absolutely important, and people are super focused on them. But I think that there's something just fundamentally offensive about the idea of the highest office in the country being held by someone who offends the dignity of many, many people.
Yeah.
I just want to say shout outs to Black women. They're beautiful, and they're the smartest group in America.
Yes. Amen. Amen. I think we have time for one more audience question.
I think we do have another one. Yes, I'll give you the mic. Here you go.
Thank you so much. I'm Caleb. I work at Verizon, and I'm really glad to be here. I wanted to ask sort of direct a question to you, Ms. Polgreen, about just your stewardship of the contributor program at the Huffington Post from 2016 to 2018 was great. It's what helped me get my start and why I'm here, basically. So thank you. But I wanted to ask, the inclusion of voices on the ground who aren't necessarily reporting, but more like editorial writing, just I think is so vital to the number of voices talking about these issues. And I'm wondering if that's something that not only you guys at HuffPo, but at various different news organizations can benefit from and can draw upon to create the kind of really boost the discourse that we're talking about here in a positive angle.
Yeah, it's a great question. For those of you who aren't familiar, HuffPost from 2005 till 2018 operated what was really in many ways the first kind of UGC platform for people to share their views and opinions that would be published out on the internet and part of a broader site. This is before Facebook really got going, before Twitter and all that, and it was really at the time revolutionary. And in 2018, we made the decision to stop publishing posts from contributors, and it was for a variety of reasons. But I think the biggest and most important one was we live in an age of disinformation. In which if everybody's talking, then nobody's heard. And there are so many platforms in which people are expressing their opinions, and it felt really important to me that if someone came to HuffPost, that the article that they were reading, they would know was something that was factual, was vetted, was edited, and had real reporting behind it. And I think that having an open platform like that made it very hard for us to keep that promise to our audience. And it turns out, as we've gone back and looked at what's in that archive, there are things that I think were really, really dangerous. For example, there was some anti-vax content on that platform that clearly is a hazard to people's health, and so we ended up having to go back and get rid of all of that. So it was a really tough call because, as you say, I think that there were also a lot of really important voices that got elevated through that platform who would not have access to that same kind of platform before. So what we've tried to do is bring those voices in through other means, whether it's through, pieces that we write for Black Voices, or our personal section where we do first-person storytelling with a really strong emphasis on bringing in the firsthand experiences of people of color. The other thing is, I think people rightly criticized HuffPost for many years for essentially taking advantage of writers by not paying them. And as someone who's been a professional journalist all my life, I think it's important that you pay people for their work, and I think it's doubly important that you pay people of color for their work. So to me, it felt like this was a transition and a shift that we needed to make. But we absolutely are always trying to make sure that we are foregrounding the experiences of underrepresented and marginalized communities in all of the editorial work that we do.
Lastly, I want to ask all of the panelists, how can newsrooms better support and help Black journalists and audience? I'm going to start with you, Marquise.
Yeah, I think obviously having more of us is a no-brainer, but I think once we're in the doors, it's actually, once you see someone is showing value, actually put value back into them. I think that's the biggest thing. It's nothing worse than you feel like you're crushing the game, and 2-3 years later you look back and you're still having to do everything on your own. If someone's showing their potential, then put the resources behind them to elevate them as much as possible. So the more that's able to happen, the more we can be successful.
I think Lydia mentioned it earlier, and I want to pick back up on it. Just because you have Black folks in your newsroom doesn't mean that you yourself, if you're not a person of color, are not exhibiting your own internal biases towards them. It means giving them opportunities to thrive and to challenge them, but also being willing to criticize them and to help them grow if they need that help. I've seen a lot of people that have not been given advice that they really need, and I think it's out of this sense of maybe fear of criticizing someone of color, as if they're going to take it as a race-based issue, which just means that person does not get better. And then it means they never grow and they never move forward, which means you've just done a disservice to that person, frankly. And that whole paternalism, right? If you are going to allow other members in your newsroom to fly, to tackle things that they've never tackled before and to be challenged, you have to do that as well for your Black journalists. Because most likely they are incredibly talented, incredibly intelligent, and if you give them the opportunity, they will grow and they will thrive.
Phil?
Yeah, I think creating internships and actually allowing people of color to kind of be in those internships and thrive. Myself, I started off as an intern. Without that internship at HuffPost in 2015, I would not be sitting here, right? So creating those sorts of opportunities for people to kind of like grow and thrive, and then developing them and offering sort of like mentorship to them. That stuff is so important to actually being able to find and secure talent.
Yeah, I think that bringing in like new diverse talent is really critical, but I think developing and providing new opportunities for the talent that you have is equally critical. Like, like creating career pathways and opportunities for growth, like real feedback, I totally agree, is a really big, important part of it. And I think that in many cases, managers, particularly managers who are not from communities of color, with this kind of soft bigotry of low expectations, like, are afraid to give honest feedback to people of color. But I think that that's like a lack of training. I think that's a lack of that they need to be trained. And I tell my teams that, like, if you do not feel comfortable giving feedback to anybody who reports to you, then why should I trust you as a manager? And so I think that's a really important part of it. I think ultimately one of my biggest struggles is that everyone keeps poaching my talent, and I think that if you're a place like HuffPost, where we really focus on bringing in and developing folks like Phil, who came in as an intern, other newsrooms spot that, and they say, "Oh, I want to hire," in the New York Times or the Washington Post or whoever says, "Oh, that person is super talented. They're doing amazing work at HuffPost. We're going to hire that person." And I could have hurt feelings about that, but instead I choose to celebrate that people are seeing opportunities to grow in their careers and move on. But also, I'm really mad at those other newsrooms for taking our best people. So
I am too. They keep taking away my friends.
I know. Trust me.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for joining us. Please join me in thanking our amazing panelists. Yes, give it up for them. Give it up for them. And thank you to our audience in studio and at home for tuning in. We may have to wrap up here, but please keep this conversation going on at home with the hashtag Reporting While Black.